Today I'll be talking about managing multiple perspectives. This is a process of figuring out how to work your projects in such a way that you make the best use of the interdisciplinary approach that we are engaged in international studies. Now, interdisciplinary is itself a somewhat problematic term that means different things to different people, so I want to take a little bit of time to talk about that. There are four terms that you hear at various times that involve working across or within multiple academic disciplines. One of these terms is cross-disciplinary. Cross-disciplinary usually refers to the coordinated effort involving two or more academic disciplines on a single project. So if you imagine a geographer engaged in a project in the Middle East and he discovers that he lacks sufficient expertise to continue on his own, so he brings in a geologist. The geologist helps him with the understanding the ecological issues he's dealing with, but then they realize that they need someone who understands the biological ecologies more, so they bring in an ecological biologist or a zoologist or something. And so a number of different disciplines, they work across the two disciplines, they inform each other, they work on projects together. Closely related to this is the term multidisciplinary. Multidisciplinary is usually used to refer to making use of several disciplines at once in order to seek completeness. Multidisciplinary work is different from cross-disciplinary work in that it usually doesn't arise out of the problem itself. It's usually part of the initial design. There's a notion that, well, gosh, we want to cover all the aspects. So we want to bring in someone who is a specialist in ecologies and someone who is an expert in economics and someone who is an expert in society and someone who's an expert in history and so on until you get, and each person will do their piece of the project so that you have a complete project. The problem with this, of course, is that if you're working from a problem-centered approach, you are not sure which of these various disciplinary approaches are going to be the most important and relevant to your project. But there was a time when it was very much in vogue to show on your project designs that you were being multidisciplinary. Transdisciplinary is quite different. The transdisciplinary is a term that tends to get used most when referring to approaches that seek to transcend the boundaries of traditional disciplinary assumptions, methods, or perspectives. So people who will lay claim to being transdisciplinary argue that disciplines, rather than being strengths, are weaknesses, that they put up artificial boundaries on questions that one can ask or methods one can use to answer them. And so transdisciplinary approaches tend to use lots of different methods. They tend to see disciplines as constraining rather than enabling, and they develop broad theoretical approaches for going into problems. Transdisciplinary work tends to primarily occur at an academic level. You don't find it a lot in problem-oriented research, although that may change as transdisciplinary work becomes more and more popular. The approach that we mean by interdisciplinary at Miami involves a process of combining two or more disciplinary approaches in order to build a broader, more coherent explanation or interpretation. That is, you have people who are trained in different disciplines, trained to ask different kinds of questions, trained to look at problems from different sets of assumptions, and you bring them together to dialogue and talk with one another. Or to put it a different way, you can draw upon the assumptions and questions of all of these different disciplines in a way that allows you to create a broader and more coherent means of both understanding your problem and coming to a solution for it. Here at Miami, of course, the interdisciplinary approach involves political science, economics, anthropology, geography, and history. And so what I'm going to give you here is one model for how one might build an interdisciplinary approach to problems in global problems in a policy analysis, drawing on these 5 disciplines. So let's begin with political science. Political science assumes that all social units are political. It's not only families, not only countries are political, but families, communities, enterprises, alliances, classrooms can be political. This works because of the way that political science defines the political. All of these kinds of organizations are political in that their members organize and disagree around issues of resource allocation, behavioral norms, and ownership of authority. That is, in any kind of group where there are resources to be had, there will be struggles over who gets to control those resources and who gets to use them. There will be arguments about appropriate ways to behave within the group and between members of the group. And there will be struggles over the authority to make decisions about these other 2 issues. In making these kinds of assumptions, political science teaches us to put conflict at the center of understanding an issue, and then seek to analyze relations of conflict and power. And when you're doing problem-based research, you can see how useful it is to start with a conflict. Where there's a conflict, there's a problem. There are stakeholders who have different interests in that issue and who are struggling over it. The question that political science pushes us to ask then about any issue is, how is power distributed and used to manage conflict? Who among these organizations has power? Who has what kinds of power? How do they use that power? And how is that power used to manage the conflict, whether to escalate it, to de-escalate it, to take control, to give up control? How is power distributed? How is it used? When you follow the political science approach in your project, there's going to be 3 steps that you're going to take. The first is locating the stakeholders in the event or situation. Then second, determining what each one risks and what they hope to gain. And then third, analyzing how relations of power are distributed and used to manage conflict between the stakeholders in terms of managing these risks and potential rewards. Economics is a very different kind of discipline, but it actually works very well with political science approaches. Economics makes a slightly different assumption about the basic unit of analysis. Economics assumes that all social units, individuals, groups, states, act rationally. Now, to understand this, you have to know what economists mean by rationality. The assumption that economists make is that units, whether individuals, groups, nation states, will always seek to maximize their gains and minimize their losses as best they can given their understanding of the situation. Now, this last part, given their understanding of the situation, is extremely important. This is a point that anthropology makes a very big deal out of as a kind of corrective to economic assumptions, and we'll come to that later. So, what economics teaches us to do is to understand the behavior of stakeholders in a situation, and in theory to predict how they will act in the future, by describing what each stakeholder risks and what they stand to gain in any given situation. So you can see how it fits hand in glove with the political science approach that we just talked about. The question that economics teaches us to ask is, what are the costs and benefits of particular courses of action for the various stakeholders? So we build on the political science approach by now looking at how stakeholders could act and asking how, if they act in a particular way, what it will cost them and what it might gain them. Now we want to turn to the remaining three disciplines: anthropology, geography, and history, all of which offer a series of correctives for this political economic framework. In other words, what we've started with is a system, a political economic approach that could be used to analyze any kind of system. What anthropology and geography and history do is they question some of those assumptions, and in doing so they broaden the scope of your analysis and deepen the way that you will research and generate policy recommendations for that issue. So let's begin with anthropology and the anthropological assumption, which is that knowledge of how the system works will differ according to different perspectives that different kinds of groups have. What this means is that while economists assume that all peoples will act rationally, sometimes what appears as irrational activity from an analytical point of view might appear to be quite rational to actors operating according to different cultural logics. That is, in addition to power and wealth, social actors might view principles and values as equally significant. People might act according to a belief in honor, a belief in the imminent return of a supernatural figure to end the world. So, the anthropological assumption means that a social actor might act quite rationally to maximize symbolic capital, values or principles or religious beliefs, or to maximize their social capital, status or reputation, honor or belonging, in addition to or even instead of economic or political capital, that is, wealth or power. So anthropology teaches us to ask two questions of the events and issues that serve as a corrective on the political economic assumptions. The first of these is, what do these events mean to the peoples who are involved in them? And the second question anthropologists teaches us to ask is, how do these beliefs and values shape people's interactions? One of my favorite examples of this is the relationship between the United States and Iran. And this comes from a book by the anthropologist William Beeman called Mad Mullahs and the Great Satan. And what Beeman claims is that Iran and the United States have fundamental cultural differences. The way that they believe the world works is fundamentally different on many, many different levels. Just as one example, he argues that Iranians tend to think that in all interpersonal interactions there's a hierarchical relationship, and in their language even your choice of verbs is predicated on whether you position yourself as slightly above or slightly below, or very much above or very much below the person that you are talking to. You can't speak neutrally in terms of hierarchical relationships. But Iranians believe that nation-states should all be seen as on an equal playing field. Now, the United States, Beeman argues, operates exactly differently. For the United States is the preeminent nation in the world, and we expect a certain kind of exceptionalism. We expect our voice to be heard as it deserves to be in a hierarchical relationship of nations based on wealth and power. On the other hand, in interpersonal situations, Americans tend to be very egalitarian. And sometimes it shocks even our closest allies, as when George Bush gave a sudden massage to German Chancellor Angela Merkel, and I mean the look on her face, she was just so shocked that he would do this right in the middle of a meeting of state. What Beeman argues is that this is just one of many, many fundamental differences that the two countries have, and as a result of their inability to see the world from each other's perspectives, that is, to perceive the cultural logics by which the others work, for more than 30 years, each country has created policies and taken actions that are designed to make the other country behave in a certain way, and for more than 30 years, both countries have failed miserably in achieving this objective. The answer, Beeman says, is that if you want to make policies that will actually affect other countries, you have to be able to understand the cultural logics that make them tick. He argues that the United States frequently doesn't do this, but he also argues that the same thing is true of countries like Iran. The title of his book captures this in a nutshell. The Iranians never behave the way we think rational actors ought to behave, so we say they're all crazy, the mad mullahs. On the flip side, the Iranians can't understand why Americans consistently behave in ways that, as they see the world, nations shouldn't behave. And so they see us as evil. And so we have the mad mullahs versus the great Satan, both nation-states demonizing the other, and neither able to create any kind of policy relationship that will get the others to move in the directions that they want them to move. Geography offers a very different kind of corrective to the political-economic way of analyzing problems by assuming the importance of the relationships between groups of people and the places where they live, their environments, their ecologies, their demographic relationships. Many apparently political conflicts, geography assumes, have important spatial and environmental contexts that are often not taken into account. For example, we had a group once who was trying to deal with the Darfur crisis at a time when the Mujahideen were still an active pillaging force, and many people wanted the Sudanese state to intervene and stop them. And one of the things that became clear in my students' research is that the Sudanese state did not, in fact, actually have the military power to stop the Mujahideen without conceding territory to the revolutionaries who they were holding at bay in the south. And so what was often talked about as a purely political and economic issue turned out to actually have these important geographical issues. They could not move troops from one part of the country to another to deal with the Mujahideen without creating all kinds of consequences for themselves. So many apparently political conflicts have important spatial and environmental contexts that have to be taken into account, and that's what geography teaches you to assume. The geographic project, then, emphasizes the description and an analysis of the relations between people and the spaces they occupy and their environments. Geography urges us to broaden our analysis from just the stakeholders in a conflict to broader contexts. How are the stakeholders situated within particular kinds of population shifts, particular kinds of environmental changes, particular kinds of ecological impacts? In so doing, geography tries to get us to look at constraints that might not occur to us when we look strictly at the actions of the people involved and assume that they're not constrained or that there are no obstacles to their actions. So, for example, geography would urge us to think about, how a dam built in one country might create further problems for nations downriver. This is actually something that happened when Egypt built the Aswan Dam with Soviet help and blocked the river enormous amounts of African silt that used to flow down that river into the Mediterranean stopped flowing there, and it within a decade it had halved the productivity of the fishing industries in Greece, where fish relied on that silt. Or, for example, are there enough consumers to make a free market solution feasible? I had a group of students who were suggesting a particular kind of investment in a project as a solution to the problem. But when they began to look at it demographically, they realized that in creating the project that they had in mind, only about 6% of the people in the country would actually be able to afford to take advantage of it. Geography might teach you to ask a question like, how can international groups be resettled if their traditional lands no longer support them because of environmental degradation? So imagine a refugee camp. It's run by the UN. The UN's goal is ultimately repatriation, putting the refugees back where they came from. But in the meantime, because of war or because of mismanagement by the government that the refugees fled from, the land has become worthless as farmland or as herding land, and the people, if they are repatriated there, can't actually make a living off that land. Thinking about those spatial and ecological and environmental issues is a really important corrective for a lot of the more superficial kinds of political economic analysis. And finally, there's the historical project. History assumes that every people and every social event has a past, and that people use that past to understand who they are and to explain current events, including the event that you are taking as your research problem. The project of history, then, is to create a chronological description and analysis of events in the development of a people or of the institutions that you're dealing with, including explanation and commentary about those events. So the historical question for us is, how did things get where they are now? And this is an absolutely crucial question that all of you will have to address in your opening chapters. Okay, I hope this helps. We're actually going to move on and take, in 2 more lessons, take these again in a little more depth in smaller pieces. And I hope that will be equally useful.